Arguably, the most important part of ISA Server is its firewall capabilities. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to configure ISA Server to allow and block stuff. After all, it's what a firewall does. It either lets things pass through, or it blocks them from getting through, depending on how you have it configured. So in our ISA management console, on the left-hand side here, we're going to select our firewall policy. And right here, this is where we'll be doing almost all of the management of the firewall itself. Now, most of the time, when it comes to managing your firewall, you'll be wanting to make changes that pertain to the allowing or denying of certain ports, URLs, and services. For example, you might want to allow people to visit certain websites, and you want to block others. Now, you might want to run services like DNS, DHCP, or SMTP on your firewall, or at least allow those protocols through your firewall. Now, you might want to let Bob access a certain destination, but prevent Bill from getting to the same place. And most of these day-to-day style changes, the ones that you'll be responsible for implementing as your company requirements change, they'll be done right here with access rules. So as we can see here in the middle of our console, we've got 3 rules currently on our ISA server. Now the one at the bottom here, of course, is a default rule that comes built into ISA server, which denies everything. And that's the big bad block we have when ISA server itself is installed, allows nothing through. And above that, we've got the 2 rules that we created in an earlier video. And these 2 rules here, we've got one to allow our users on our internal network to get out onto the internet, and we also have another one for our ISA server itself to get out onto the internet. So let's build on this knowledge that we've got from our previous videos, and we'll take a look at creating a few more rules to further lock down or open up our firewall as the case may be. Now, even though we've got blanket access to the internet right now, we're going to create some very specific rules to deny certain things, since it's very likely that you're going to want to run with a similar scenario in your company. You'll probably have a universal allow everything rule like what we've done here, whereby any website would be accessible, and then you'll block specific sites through your rules. Now, before we go and create any new rules, I want to just go back to our Vista machine again, and let's create a rule to block YouTube. But obviously, I want to check that YouTube is actually up and working right now, because otherwise, how are we going to tell if our rule's actually working? So let's go and open up Internet Explorer, and we're going to go to youtube.com. All right, well, it's up with a obviously rather interesting front picture there, but that's not important right now. The fact is that it's up is all we needed to know. So let's go back to our ISA server, and I'm going to prevent users from wasting their time looking at things like this. So back on our ISA server, we're going to go and create a new access rule again. Now we'll need to give the rule a name. Let's call this one blocked websites, and we'll click next. Now we're going to choose deny here because we don't want people visiting these sites that we're going to use in this rule. So we'll click next again. Now again, we could choose selected protocols like we've done in all examples so far. But since we really don't want people to access any sites that we're going to add to this rule, in most cases, I'd assume that you don't want them to access it in any way, shape or form. So rather than specifically listing out protocols like HTTP here, I'm going to choose all outbound traffic. That way, anything going to YouTube will be blocked. And don't forget that a lot of your users aren't stupid. They're going to find a way to circumvent whatever blocks that you put in place. So if you only specify HTTP is being blocked, they're going to try HTTPS. Now, if you block that, they'll try FTP, and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to block everything from the get-go by choosing all outbound traffic. So we'll click next. Now the traffic is coming from our internal network, so we'll click Add, we'll expand networks, we'll choose Internal, we'll click Add, Close, and then Next. Now where's our traffic going? Well, it's going out to the internet to youtube.com. So we're going to click Add, and up the top here, we're going to click the New drop-down window here, and we're going to create a new URL set. Now we need to give this a name. Again, I'm going to call this one Blocked Websites. And we're going to click Add, And I'm going to enter in a URL here of http:///youtube.com. Now the reason I prefer to use the *.youtube rather than just www.youtube.com is that this rule will then catch any YouTube subdomains. So an example might be videos.youtube.com, which of course is different from www.youtube.com. And bear in mind here that you can add in more than a single address. So we could click add again, and we could add in, say, *.msn.com, and hotmail.com and google.com and as many more as we need, depending on what we like. So let's just leave both of these here. We'll leave our YouTube and MSN ones in the list. We'll click OK. Now we'll expand URL sets. We'll select our blocked websites URL set. We'll click the Add button. Then we'll click Close. Then we'll click Next. We'll apply this to all users. We'll click Next again. And then Finish. Now we'll click on the Apply button, as we've done many times now, and this will save our changes, and our rule is now in effect. So let's see if it worked. So here we are, switched back over to our Windows Vista machine. So let's try and refresh our browser by hitting F5. And we can see here that we now have a 502 proxy error telling us that our ISA server denied the request to get to youtube.com. So let's go and try msn.com. All right, well, that one's blocked as well. But if we type in a different web address, obviously something which isn't on our list of banned sites, let's say hp.com, you can see that the page is beginning to load. All right, well, I've just switched back to our ISA server, and the reason that Hewlett-Packard's website was loading successfully is due to our third rule here in our list, which grants blanket access to any website. You see, now this is very important. When you're designing your rules, you simply must pay attention to the order in which they appear in this list, because ISA server certainly does. When ISA server is processing a request, and let's use our hp.com request as an example here, the user on the internal network, they've just fired up Internet Explorer, and they've tried to get to hewlettpackard.com or hp.com. So that request hits our ISA server, which then checks this request against the list of rules here. Now it sees this first rule here, which is for our blocked websites. So checking this against the incoming request, we can see that this is an outbound request, so that matches our request for hp.com. We'll scroll across, we can see it's from the internal network, and that matches our request for hp.com. And it's going, obviously, to hp.com, so is that a site on our block list? Is that in the list? No, hp.com isn't in the list, so that doesn't match. So we move on to the next rule. Now this rule is for the ISA server itself to get out onto the internet. So that doesn't match because our traffic isn't coming from localhost, it's coming from the internal network. So we'll move on to the next rule in the list. Okay, well this request here is using HTTP, so there's a match. It's coming from the internal network, so there's a match. It's going out to the external internet, so there's a match. And it's coming from any user. Again, there's another match. So we've matched everything, so what's the action we're going to take? Allow. And as you saw, access to HP's website is granted. So to further illustrate the importance of how our rules are ordered, let's test our rules again, but this time we'll do it here from the ISA server itself because we're here. However, this time we're going to change their order somewhat. This time we'll take this blocked websites rule and let's place it second in the list. And to do that, we'll simply select the rule and click Move Selected Rules Down. All right, now we'll go and apply that change and click OK. So now we'll go and open up Internet Explorer on our ISA server here, and we'll go to hp.com. And you can see that it's working fine, just as it did with our Vista machine. But what about if we go to one of the block sites like msn.com? Wow, you can see that's loading up too. What about youtube.com. Alright, well, that's firing up as well. But why? Didn't we just block them? Sure we did. Let's go back to our management console, and you'll notice that, of course, our second rule here is blocking a couple of those websites, but our first rule is allowing our ISA server access to the internet. Because our blocked websites rule appears after our allow rule, ISA server processes rules from first to last. So this second rule never gets evaluated because our first rule matches our attempt to access the internet. So of course, the solution here is to take our blocked websites rule, and here in the task pane, we'll want to move that back up, placing it first in the list. Although, I will admit that that's not quite going to be enough because our ISA server itself isn't part of the internal network. So let's just double click on this rule and we'll select the From tab, and here we're going to click the Add button. We'll expand networks, we'll choose localhost, we'll click Add, Close, and then we'll click OK. And now let's apply this change so that our blocked websites rule is always going to be evaluated first. That way when we add new sites to this rule, they'll always be blocked regardless of these two blanket allow rules below. This rule here is going to have priority. Okay, well let's go back to YouTube and we'll hit F5 to refresh it, and this time you can see that we're blocked. So as you can see here, the order of these rules is critical. Just one rule in the wrong spot can cause you a lot of problems. For example, if we were again to take either of these allow rules, and let's use the ISA server one since we're on ISA server at the moment, and move it, of course, up again, and apply that change, we'll click OK, and if we go back and hit F5, you can see that we're back in business. And of course, if we try and go to the other site, which was msn.com, that one's going to load as well. So let's quickly go over to our Vista machine and let's go and try there. Alright, we'll switch back to our Vista machine. Let's go and load up YouTube. This time, it's blocked. We could access it from our ISA server, but here it's blocked. And what about MSN? That's blocked as well. Finally, let's go and try HP again. And you can see that that one's loading. Alright, well back here on our ISA server, we can see that our first rule is to allow our ISA server access to the internet. Our blocked websites is coming in second. But our allow internet access, this is the one here that's affecting our Vista machine because that's coming from our internal network. So since our blocked websites rule appears before our allow internet access rule, any of these sites that are on that list are going to be evaluated first. So if we're trying to hit from the internal network, YouTube or MSN, we're going to be blocked because our blanket allow internet access rule appears second. So the moral of the story? Rules are going to work in the order that they're processed. Now understand that because the functionality of ISA server depends on it, and you need to think about this when you start designing your own set of rules. Alright, well let's move on now and let's take a closer look at these rules here. Let's just use our deny rule at the bottom. We can either right click on it and we could choose properties, or we could simply just double click on it. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick look at some of the options you have when editing a rule that you've created using the wizard. The reason I want to show you this is that although most of the options you'll see in here you'll instantly recognize from the wizard you used when you created this rule, there are a few options that you can change that don't appear in the wizard. So firstly, on our general tab here, you can rename this rule, although we can't actually rename this one because it is the default rule. All of our other ones we'd be able to rename. In fact, let's choose one of those. Let's just go and edit one of these ones. You can see here that field is now editable. So we could change the name if we like, we could add a description as well, and we could also disable this rule if we like by unchecking the enable box. Now on the action tab, we can choose to allow or deny traffic. But here, if you choose to deny access to a resource, you can also choose to redirect the request to another page, such as a custom error page or a warning page telling your users that this has been blocked due to corporate policy or something like that. And that's useful as it's more friendly to users when they receive a custom page rather than just simply the default deny page, and we've already seen that page being thrown up a few times. Now, as you can see down the bottom of this window here, we're also going to log any requests that match this rule. So if someone tries to visit one of our banned sites, we'll be capturing the fact that they tried to get to a banned destination. So we can go and hit them over the head later on. Alright, maybe you don't want to go that far, but it does allow us to have proof of their intentions just in case we need that information later on. The Protocols tab is the same as we saw in the wizard. We can see this rule is applying to selected protocols, and there's the protocols there. So of course we can add or select and remove these if we like. Now the From and the To tabs are also the same with one exception, and I mean that literally, by the way, since we can add an exception to this rule. And taking our rule here where we've said everyone can have internet access, we could click Add, and we could define an exception to this rule. For example, we could add in a computer that would be excluded from the rule. In fact, I've just clicked on the To column here, so let's go to the From column and we'll do the same thing. We'll click Add under the exceptions. Now don't forget, up the top here we're applying this to every machine in our internal network. So right now our Vista machine, if we select that one, is currently applying this rule. So if we select our Vista machine and click Add and add it to the exclusions, then what will happen is all of the computers in our internal network except this one Vista machine will be applying this rule. So therefore this rule is giving everyone access to the internet except this machine. So those exceptions are kind of useful. Now our next tab here is the Content Types tab, and this allows us to filter the request based on the sort of content that's being retrieved. Now currently we're looking at all content here, but we could say that we only want to allow specific types like images, and the rest of the page would be blocked. Now that would still be useful to people, so we could allow them to get certain information, but to keep bandwidth and time wasting to a minimum by perhaps not letting people get to the multimedia content or other higher bandwidth content. Now next we've got a Users tab, and here of course we could specify users that this rule is applying to, and again you'll see down the bottom here we can have exceptions. Finally we've got our Schedule tab, which lets us specify at what times of the day do we want this rule to apply. Now the default, as you can see, is, well, it's all blue, which means it's active, so this rule is applying at any time of day. But you could change this so that it only applies on weekends or specific work hours. Or if these things don't suit you, you can click on the New button and you can define your own schedule. And it's as simple as entering in a name for our schedule here and then dragging your mouse over the time that you want to allow, or deny for that matter. It's currently set to active, so if we click the Inactive button, that's going to block out all of this time here, highlighting this particular section as inactive. So if the time in this schedule here is blue, then the rule will apply. If it's white, the rule won't apply. And these schedule rules can be useful because if you have a rule that prevents you from downloading videos and images and things I mentioned just a moment ago during business hours, but after hours, when everyone's gone home, you might decide to allow these objects to be downloaded. So these schedules can be really flexible. All right, now once you've made any changes here, you can simply click OK, and then that rule will be live. And I'm just quickly going to take in the action field that was away and change it to allow. We'll click OK. As I just wanted to show you in our From column here, our little computer icon here for my Vista machine, you can see it's got this black slash through the icon, which is a visual clue showing you that this machine is listed as an exception. You can see it's still listed in the rule, but it's actually exempt from applying it. So there's your visual clue. All right, well, I'm going to click discard here. I'm not going to apply those changes because I don't really want them on our machine. Now, the next thing I'd like to cover in this video is the ability to also further control the configuration of several protocols for our rules. So if we right-click on our Allow Internet Access rule here, you'll note right down the bottom we've got this section here that says Configure HTTP. And I will point out that this menu option is only going to appear if the rule happens to be using that protocol, which you can see it is, and the action is set to allow. So our rule here is configured to use HTTP, the action is set to allow, and you can see that we have this item appear in the menu. So if we go and double click on this rule though, and we'll go to our Protocols tab, I'm going to click Add. I'll expand Web and we'll add in FTP, and we'll click Close and then OK. And let's quickly apply that change. Now if we go and right click on our rule again, you'll notice that we can also configure FTP as well. So we'll take a look at both of these items. Firstly, let's select the top one, configure HTTP, and this will bring up a new window containing a whole bunch of settings relating to HTTP. So let's go through them now. So firstly, under our request headers heading, we've got this field here where we can enter in the maximum headers length, and this refers to the header that's sent in an HTTP request. So you can restrict the size of the total header, and you can see it's currently set to 32,768 bytes. And this feature's there because there have been known attacks on web servers that can send oversized headers to a server in an attempt to cause a buffer overflow, and that can lead to all sorts of problems, such as a hacker gaining control over your server. Now this problem was around with iOS 4 and 5, which you really shouldn't be using anymore, and it even affected some Cisco gear. So rather than having those oversized headers being sent to an old machine or perhaps an unpatched server, we can prevent that from happening right here. Now, I will remind you though that this rule that we're currently looking at is actually for our outbound requests that we send to servers outside our network. So this setting here isn't going to affect our internal servers, but it will prevent malicious internal users from compromising other people's servers. But we can of course configure a similar rule for incoming requests where our servers could be the ones at risk. Alright, our next option here is to allow any payload length, although if we uncheck this box, we can enter in a value here in bytes if we want to limit the payload to a specific value. Now payload is simply a term used to describe the actual data being sent. So for example, this could be used to limit the amount of data a user could post into your website in a web publishing scenario. So here you could enter in a value which you believe would be reasonable to expect a user to post on your site, and anything larger than that would then be rejected. Again, that's more of an example for incoming traffic rather than our outbound traffic here, which this rule is currently applying to. Alright, next we have our maximum URL length, which is set to 10,240 bytes, and that's rather a lot. So here we're talking about the web address you type into Internet Explorer when you want to visit a website, like www.microsoft.com. Now do bear in mind though, that some dynamic sites can use pretty large URLs, especially those that use session identification, or sites like Hotmail and so on. And in all honesty, you probably won't need to change this, unless of course this is an inbound rule and you want to restrict them to a smaller URL so that people aren't trying to cause buffer overflows on your servers. But all in all, the defaults here should be fine. Now we could also limit the maximum query length as well, and this query length is the part of the URL that appears after a question mark. So if we open up Internet Explorer here and we'll type something into Bing, let's just type in test and we'll hit enter. Okay, up in the address bar here, anything that you see after this question mark, that's the query string. And you'll see this sort of thing being used on a lot of different sites. So limiting these query strings can be a good idea because certainly in the past, internet worms have used the long query string to embed their malicious data into it to cause some problems. Now you can see here we can also perform normalization in a query. Now have you ever seen a URL containing a bunch of % characters in it? In fact, rather than just talking about it, let's try and make this more of a visual example. Let's go back to Internet Explorer and we'll enter in a bogus URL. We'll just say bing.com/this %20 URL %20 doesn't %20 exist .htm. Now if you can read this URL, you'd already know that it doesn't actually exist. It's just so that I can visually explain this topic. These escape characters, this %20 20 here, they represent a character that a URL isn't allowed to have. %20 actually represents a blank space. Now, since spaces aren't allowed in a URL, if you have a path on your web server or if you've got a file and its name has a space in it, the URL will be substituted with this %20 escape character where those spaces are supposed to be. So whenever your web server reads the URL, it performs normalization on it and substitutes these escape characters for the real character. So this URL would really read, if we delete these %20s, it would read something like that. So if we were to head over to bing.com and take a look at their servers, there'd be a file, in this particular example of course, called this URL doesn't exist.htm. Now, Microsoft recommend that you do switch this setting on, as malicious users in the past have created specially crafted URLs like that by using double encoded requests, and they can cause problems. So by turning this feature on, ISAServer will perform normalization on the URL twice to ensure that the URL is a valid one. Now, if it's not, it's going to drop the request. Now, it's worth mentioning though that while it is recommended to turn this feature on, if you do, it might cause problems with some legitimate requests. So if you do turn it on and you have some problems, you can just come in here and switch it back off again. Now, we can also block high bit characters, which means that if you check this box, any URLs that contain double bit characters or Latin 1 characters, they'll be blocked. So you're going to have additional security, but you might find that URLs that use different languages to display characters that we don't normally use in English, they might not be able to be accessed. Now finally, at the bottom, we can block responses that contain Windows executable content, and this is going to block any response that contains content that could be executed on your computer. So in other words, .exe files and other executable software. Alright, well, our next tab is the Methods tab. And methods, they're used by a host to send to a server to get it to perform a certain action. For example, a GET request tells the web server that we want to retrieve an object such as a web page. So here we could choose to allow all methods, which is the default. We could specify a list of methods that we want to allow, or we could specify a list of methods that we want to block. So suppose we're configuring an inbound rule here to our web server. We could prevent outside users from posting on our website by choosing block specified methods, and then we'll click Add, and we'd specify the post method and click OK. Now, if you do want to see a more comprehensive list of the available methods, I'd check out w3.org and you'll find the complete list there. Okay, well, next we have the Extensions tab, and the default here is to allow all extensions. But as with our methods, we could choose to allow them all, allow only those that we specify below, or block those listed below and then allow the others. So let's select blocked again, we'll choose Add, and now we'll simply need to enter in a file extension here. So let's enter in .php for argument's sake, and we'll click on OK. And now PHP files, they won't be allowed, although you'll probably find that that sort of extension isn't going to make you too popular. Alright, well, down the bottom here, we could also block requests containing ambiguous extensions, which simply means that if this box here is checked, then ISAServer will block any file that doesn't have a file extension, or ISAServer can't figure out what the file extension is. Alright, well, our next tab here is the Headers tab, and by default we'll be allowing through any header except those that we specify in this list here. So again, we'll click the Add button, and you'll notice our Add button isn't doing anything. Sometimes I've found with ISAServer, if we sit on this window too long, occasionally it seems to stop working. So let's just click Cancel, and we're going to go back in there again, go to our Headers tab and click Add, and this time you can see it works there. A little bug, I'm not sure why it does that, but nonetheless it's not a deal breaker. Alright, well, our Headers tab here, we can specify an HTTP header to block, and here we can choose to search either the request headers or the response headers. Now, since our rule here is actually a rule for outbound access, I'm going to choose our request headers, and then we can enter in the header restrictions that we want. Now, this is useful since most firewall administrators, they configure port 80 for HTTP traffic to be allowed. Application writers, however, They know that their software is likely to be used if its data can be tunneled back to the user over port 80. So here, we could block something like peer-to-peer traffic by using the header P2P agent. Or perhaps we could block torrents by using .torrent. Now, I'm not going to go through a list of all the types of headers that you can use. There's mountains of possible ones to consider. So I'd encourage you to check out your favorite search engine and do a search for HTTP headers or HTTP application signatures, and then you can go from there. Okay, the next section we have down here is the server header, and this is a server header from your internal server. Well, the default here is to return the original header. You know when you go to a website and the page doesn't exist and you get a 404 error? Well, I'm sure you do. Well, if the administrator hasn't configured an error page, you'll get the default web server error page, and this is often the case. But this page in most web server software will tell you what version of the software is running. Now, this is great for attackers because you're basically gifting them that information, and it allows them then to look for known vulnerabilities for the exact version of your web software. So here, we can choose to strip the header from the response, or we could enter in a custom header, and that would allow us to either provide the user with more information, or you could enter in a header that you'd find on a different product altogether to try and thwart attackers. That way, the attacker is trying exploits for an Apache server against your IIS 7 server, and that's not going to get them too far. Although personally, I don't like inviting attacks, so I'd opt simply to strip the header from the response. Now below this we've got the via header, and this is specially used for proxy servers that may send the request on behalf of another sender. Now every time your request is sent to another server in the chain on the way to its final destination, each server will add its own via header to the list, and on the return journey each server will remove its own via header and forward the response to the server listed in the next via header until finally it gets back to where the request originated. So this setting is used to remove your ISA server's name from the request or the response. Now the default here is to send the default header, but you can of course change this to a custom header if you like. Alright, now our final tab here is the Signatures tab, and signatures are sort of like our headers, except signatures, they'll apply to both the header and the body of the object being requested, not just the header. So we'll click Add, and we'll need to provide a name and a description. Now we can search either the request URL, the request headers or body, or the response headers or the response body. So if you wanted to block anyone from using a specific web browser, say Firefox, from visiting your website, again, if this was an inbound rule, you could select request headers and then use the HTTP header, which would be user-agent, and then simply enter in the signature for Firefox. You just then give it a name, we'd call it one Firefox, and then you'd click OK. Alright, well, that's all of the tabs, so let's click Cancel here, and I'm going to right click on our Allow Internet Access rule again, and this time we'll choose the bottom option for our FTP protocol, and thankfully this one contained very little to modify. We've got one single option here, and that's to block the ability to use FTP to upload files. Now by default it is blocked, so if you want to allow FTP uploads, simply uncheck this box. Or if you're wondering why they're not working, simply uncheck this box. Alright, well let's cancel this, and you'll also note that we can double click on any of the protocols listed in the protocol column, but only the protocols themselves. And you'll notice that once we select a rule and hover our mouse over any of the protocols, that they'll be underlined. However, you'll notice that if we do it for, say, let's just expand this, all outbound traffic, in other words, not a specific protocol, we don't get the underline. So again, if we select our Allow Internet Access rule and hover our mouse over this, we're getting that underline. So let's double click on, say, FTP, and you'll see it brings up another window. So let's click on the Parameters tab, and we're going to get back more information about each protocol. Okay, well I want to move on now and discuss one more rule, just so you guys understand not only how rules are created, since you really ought to know that already from the rules that we've already built, but some rules do take a little more thought than simply just slapping down a protocol and setting it to allow. So let's consider this example. Let's say you want to install a DHCP server or a DNS server on your ISA server itself. So we'll begin by creating a new access rule, and we've seen how to do that. We'll click Create Access Rule. And let's use DHCP as our example here. So we really have two parts to DHCP really. There's a DHCP request and a DHCP reply. So right now, let's say we're dealing with DHCP request. So for our name of our rule, I'm going to enter in DHCP request. We'll click Next. We do want to allow a DHCP request. We'll click Next again. Now, we don't want to use all protocols, so we're going to leave it at selected protocols. We'll click Add. We'll expand Infrastructure. We'll choose DHCP request. We'll click Add, then Close, then Next. These requests will be coming from our internal network, so we'll click Add. We'll expand Networks. We'll choose Internal. We'll click Add, Close, Next. And where will they be going? They'll be going to the ISA server, of course, so we'll click Add. Again, we'll expand Networks. We'll choose Local Host. We'll click Add, Close, Next. We'll apply this rule to all users. We'll click Next. And finally, we'll click Finish. Now, we won't apply this yet. We're going to go and create a second rule. We'll call this one DHCP Reply. We'll click Next. Of course, we're going to want to allow our DHCP replies. We'll click Next again. Again, we're not going to use all protocols. We'll choose Add. We'll expand Infrastructure. We'll choose a DHCP reply. We'll click Add, Close, and Next. This time, the reply is going to be coming from our ISA server, so we'll click Add. We'll expand Networks. We'll choose Localhost. We'll click Add, Close, Next. And these DHCP replies will be going to our internal network. So we'll click Add, expand Networks, choose Internal, Add, Close, Next. We'll apply this rule to all users. We'll click Next and then Finish. Okay, now we've set up the firewall to allow the DHCP service to be able to send and receive DHCP packets. Of course, if this were a real situation, we'd need to finalize this setup by installing DHCP on our ISA server, and then would be cooking. And that's pretty much all there is to having these types of services run on your firewall itself. So if you're wondering why things aren't working as intended, when you review the rules that you've set up, just make sure when it's the ISA server itself you need to contact, you must reference it as localhost and not the external network, and that's a common mistake that we see a lot. In this video, we've taken a detailed look at configuring the firewall rules on your ISA server. We also saw how you can further control your firewall using the HTTP and FTP protocol configuration options. Remember, when you write your own firewall rules, it's important to pay close attention to how these rules are ordered, because as we saw, ISA server will run through the list of rules in the order they're listed until it finds a match, and it's going to stop right there, and the careful ordering of your rules can of course be the difference between making your ISA server do what you expect or breaking its security entirely. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.